Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the ICAT webinar on the ICAT series of policy assessment guides. And today we're focusing on the transport pricing policy assessment guide. I will start off slightly slowly to let everybody come on in. But the purpose of this webinar and the series of webinars is to help you better understand how you can utilize the guides and benefit from their application. So if you're trying to improve your design and implementation of your policies and to set track progress of targets such as NDCs, report domestically and internationally, or try and attract additional financing from the results of these effective policies, these assessment guides are just one tool from the ICAT toolbox that will help you to do so. This webinar is a part of a series, and we have reached the points where we are at the end of the series. So if you would like to take a look back, as you see on your screen, at the webinars that have taken place over the past 2 months, you can access these on climateactiontransparency.org, the recordings, or visit our YouTube channel, and you'll also get the presentations from them as well. You can also access via the ICAT website all the different assessment guides in their full form. And as you see, we are focusing on the transport pricing methodology, so you can also find that on our website. Without the commitment and the continual support of our donors and our implementing partners and supporting partners, the assessment guides wouldn't be possible in terms of their development and rollout. So an extra credit acknowledgement to them should be put there. Like with any webinar, we do have a few things we'd like to ask our participants to do, is to stay in listen-only mode. Questions and comments we do really encourage. As you might know from the agenda of this webinar, we have a 30-minute section on Q&A at the end. So please gather all your questions as they go, and in the dashboard of GoToWebinars you'll see. Please insert them into the question form, and we gather them up as we go, and we'll ask our panelists at the end of the session. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will share the presentations and recordings with you after this webinar. And please, so that we can improve not only this series of webinars and this webinar, but all future webinars and types of activities by filling out our evaluation form. We have a great panel of speakers, as you'll see on our screen, and I'll introduce them as we go through the series of presentations. But they've all been heavily involved in both the development or the technical creation of the assessment guide for transport pricing policy, as well as the application. Here's the agenda that we have for today, and as I said, we have 60 minutes for presentations. And the first session by Dr. Henning and Wuester is going to cover why this assessment guide is a valuable tool to use to improve the effectiveness of transport policies, followed by a technical overview by Felix Weber from iNFRAS on covering how you can utilize this assessment guide and outlining 2 assessment approaches to go with it. We look at then the impacts of transportation policies in Indonesia and how through policies on fuel pricing, low-cost green car and electric vehicles by Dr. Elly. And to wrap up the presentations, we have Buddika from Sri Lanka, who will give you an insight as to how Sri Lanka created a national MRV system for transportation sector. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Dr. Henning Wuester, who is in his office in Bonn, Germany. So thank you to all our panelists in advance, and I hope you enjoy this webinar to everybody. Thank you.
So good afternoon or good morning, colleagues. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this final webinar, and we are focusing today on a very important topic, that's launching the guide on transport pricing. So you will hear from us a lot of valuable experience in applying the guide later on, and introduction to the technical side of the guide. I will just start with an introduction to explain to you our motivation for preparing this guide and how it can be applied also together with the other ICAT assessment guides. So let me kick off by the purpose of the assessment guides as we see it from ICAT. Our work really is there to support policymakers and those that assist them to implement the Paris Agreement, to deliver on the challenge of turning global objectives into action on the ground in their countries. So let me highlight three aspects that I think are important to distinguish. The first one is that the assessment guides can help to directly improve the effectiveness in policy design and policy implementation, supporting evidence-based policy making based on sound data and information. The second one then focuses on stakeholder engagement. The assessment guides can help you create the data needed to engage stakeholders within a sector, like the transport sector, across various sectors and various levels of government, from the national to the local. And thirdly, let me highlight then accountability as the third aspect. So the guides will help to improve reporting, both at the national level and also at the international level, including to financial institutions. I'll explain this in further detail for the example of the transport pricing assessment guide. So why are we discussing transportation? So this sector clearly is a sector that has to be tackled in order for the world to tackle climate change. If countries want to achieve the 1.5 or 2 degree target, it cannot be done without tackling transport emissions. First of all, this sector has the fastest growing emissions. You see here emissions from 1970 to 2010, which more than doubled in that period. And if we look forward towards 2050, we expect another doubling under a business as usual scenario. Secondly, the main growth in transport is in road transport. You see the light blue wedge in the graph, which is road transport, and in 2010 accounted for over 70% of transport emissions. And thirdly, transport emissions very much relate to fuels. They account for 25% of CO2 emissions. And that's why we focus primarily on pricing policies that can impact the growth in fuel use in the transport sector and lead to the kind of transformation that is required. When can the guide be used during the policy cycle? So let me illustrate this with this simplified diagram and start at the top. The guide can be used ex ante when defining policy objectives, when selecting a policy, and when designing the policy. So those are the light blue circles at the right-hand side. The guide can also be used during policy implementation to track progress. That's dark blue circle. And finally, it can be used ex post to evaluate the impact and the effectiveness of a policy, which then can help to feed again into the next cycle in policy design and implementation. The information that is collected can then feed into reporting under the UNFCCC. This figure shows in a schematic way the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement, you see at the center, the big dark blue square, the biannual transparency report, and feeding into that the various components. Those components where the ICAT assessment guides can help to contribute are marked with a red circle. So you have in particular the reporting on progress made in implementing and achieving the NDCs, so NDC tracking, which feeds into the biannual transparency report. In an ex post fashion, the guides can help the technical expert review. And of course, once you are in the mode of evaluating policy implementation and the potential of policies, you can also use the guide for policy design and updating of NDCs. For us, it's very important that countries look beyond reporting. Climate policies can only become effective if they are really anchored in national development planning. And here, an assessment of climate policies that look beyond greenhouse gases and look at social, economic, and environmental indicators are critical. Examples include data to link to national development priorities or the SDGs. Job creation, economic growth, social and environmental aspects, for instance, air pollution data, which is quite critical for transport in an urban setting. This data is crucial for stakeholder engagement. Engaging important stakeholders like financial institutions, for instance, requires economic data. That's what they need to assess in order to look at investments. Both private and public finance institutions will look at that kind of data before they engage on supporting investments that help implement policies. Special case now is the use of such data in the recovery phase from the global pandemic. Here again, economic data is critical to show how climate policies can actually support economic recovery in the short and the longer run. For some of these assessments, it's important to look and utilize some of the other ICAT assessment guides. So let me end by just putting the transport pricing assessment guide in that context. You see here in dark blue the 8 ICAT assessment guides. On the left-hand side, 5 guides that focus on greenhouse gas impacts, including the transport pricing guides. They can then be applied together with the 3 guides, or one of the 3 guides in the middle of this slide that cover cross-cutting aspects. So if you want to assess greenhouse gas impacts together with other aspects like sustainable development, transformational change potential, or the contribution by subnational and non-state actors, then you can utilize these cross-cutting. And finally, on the right-hand side in light blue, you see the 2 process guides. Those are, again, complementary and are to be used together with the other assessment guides, which allow for an assessment to ensure that stakeholders are adequately engaged in the process and to ensure robustness of the assessment by using a technical review that reflects state of the art. Very important when you engage with financial institutions, for instance. So let me stop here. ICAT supports countries in building up the transparency frameworks that they need, creating the data and information and conducting the kind of assessments that we are presenting here today. Our approach is to prepare countries for effective policy processes at home. And that is then data that they can also utilize to report internationally, including reporting under the Paris Agreement. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much to you, Dr. Wuester. If you have any questions or from the last slide about using the assessment guides in combination, please also refer back to the previous webinars where they will give you examples of different countries using multiple assessment guides. We turn now to look at a technical overview of this particular assessment guide, and we have Felix Weber from iNFRAS, who is actually the co-technical lead of this assessment guide, and also helps the piloting of the project in Indonesia, which you'll also hear from later. So thank you very, very much for joining us, Felix, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josh and Henning, for the introduction. Can you hear me and see my slides?
100%.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks also for inviting me to speak in this webinar. It's an honor, and also greetings to everyone from Zurich. I will give you in the next 20 minutes an overview, a technical overview over the elements of this assessment guide, and that will help you afterwards to understand the in-country applications that we will see from Indonesia and from Sri Lanka. So let me dive right in. First, I want to talk about the purpose of this specific assessment guide. So what you can do with the assessment guide is to assess the impact of pricing policies in the transport sector. So you can assess different policies, fuel subsidy removals, increased fuel tax, or further policies like road pricing or purchase incentives for eco-friendly vehicles. All of those measures have a similarity. They will increase the relative prices of fossil fuels or of transportation means that rely on fossil fuels. The approach is very simple, and this, I want to stress this because it's important to understand that. It's a first step, and it should be applicable by most of the countries also if data availability is low. So it's a straightforward and simple approach. And finally, it is meant to be applied in any context of national or regional transport strategies. Could also be nationally determined contributions or NAMAs, nationally appropriate mitigation actions. Now, the guidance consists of 4 main steps. The first step is to choose an approach. The guidance provides 3 different approaches, A, B, and C. So approach A is the most simple approach. You have a look at just one generic fuel mix, can be a mix of gasoline and diesel, and you compute the impacts based on this top-down data. Approach B is a little more elaborated. You can distinguish between different fuels. For instance, you can look at gasoline and diesel separately and have an assessment for both of these fuels. And approach C is the most comprehensive approach. It also contains bottom-up travel activity data, and you can include the public transport in the assessment, meaning that you also have train traveling and that sort of stuff in the assessment. It's because of this, it's also restricted more on an urban and passenger transport system boundary. For the coming quarter hour, I will only have a look at approach A and C, because B is very similar to approach A. If you have any questions regarding approach B, feel free to ask them in the chat, and we can discuss them in the Q&A session. So the second step is to estimate baseline emissions. This is a very important step, and it's also a difficult step. You need to know what would have happened with the emissions if you had not done any measure, not done anything to prevent the emissions to grow. Step 3 is to estimate the demand of the price increase on the fuel on the demand of the fuel. So if you increase the price, people will demand less of it. We do this with price elasticities, and I will explain this in detail later on. And the last step is to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions, which is basically the difference between the baseline emissions and the policy scenario emissions with the demand change. Good. So let's have a look at the simple approach A assessment. I am presenting here the ex ante version of the assessment, so meaning that you have not yet conducted, you have not yet done the measure, I'm sorry, but you are planning to do something and you want to assess what the impact of that measure will be in the future. So to estimate the base year emissions, this is the first step. In this approach, you only use top-down data, meaning you have your activity data, which will be an annual vehicle fuel use. So you use an amount of gasoline in terajoule per year for the whole transport sector. You multiply this activity data with an emission factor, if possible. It's always advisable to use a country-specific emission factor. Otherwise, there are defaults provided in the guidance. And by multiplying those two numbers, you come up with base year emissions. You have to choose a base year first. So for instance, if you start your assessment right now, you may want to take a base year like 2018, where you have this data readily available. The next step is to project those base year emissions to the future to create your baseline. For that, you use a population projection. So basically, you take for the year 2018, which is your base year, you take the fuel consumption and you take the population number, and you divide that, which gives you then a fuel consumption per capita, which you keep constant. And based on this constant fuel use per capita and the projection of the population, you can multiply these two curves for every year, and you will end up with a projection of the fuel use. This is a very simple approach. You can obviously also conduct more advanced methods, comparable growth rates, trend analysis, modeling, and so on. Some hints how to do that are included in the assessment guide. Good. After having done the baseline emission assessment, you start to evaluate the fuel demand impact. I said it before, we are working with price elasticities in this guidance. So the question is, the main question we ask is how a change in the fuel price will affect the fuel demand. On the bottom right-hand side of the slide, you can see a small graph. It shows a demand function, for instance, for gasoline. It's just an example. And you can see that if you increase the price on the y-axis from P2 to P1, then you will have a reduction in the demand from Q2 to Q1. And the reduction of the demand depends on the demand curve and obviously on the price increase. So if you increase your price by 10%, depending on this demand curve, you will find, for instance, a reduction of demand by 5%. And based on those two numbers, you can compute a price elasticity, which in that case will be minus 0.5. This is an inelastic demand. So that means that if you increase the price by 1%, demand reduction will not be 1%. It will be lower than 1%. And in most of the cases, own price elasticities in the transport sector for fossil fuels are inelastic, meaning between 0 and -1. Now, with the own price elasticity, you can cover more or less all of the impacts that the price increase will have. So that can include that people travel less because it's more expensive to travel. It may be that they switch to a more efficient vehicle because it's less expensive to drive with a more efficient vehicle. Or they may even switch to a completely different transport mode, like public transport or even a bicycle. And all of those aspects should be covered in your own price elasticity, given it's a robust number and it has something backing the number. So that's a very important point. I also want to stress that the guidance does provide default elasticity values, which can be used, but should only be used if there is no studies giving values for the country specifically. The way this works in the guidance is that you need data on the fuel mix price or on the gasoline price on the left-hand side. So you have some categories of the fuel price, and you need data on the average income per capita. And if we look at an example, if you have an average income in 2016 of $13,000 US, this would then be the row in the middle, and at the same time you have an average fuel mix price of 40 cents per liter, which would be the line in the middle. You end up with an own price elasticity of demand of minus 0.24. You can see here that there is not a massive range of values that you can get from these default elasticity values. So this already tells you that there is quite some uncertainty with this approach of the default price elasticity. After having done that, you can estimate the greenhouse gas impacts. You have some data from the first two steps, or from steps 2 and 3. So you have your baseline emissions, and you have the price elasticity, as you have seen before. What you also need is the line with the label D, which is the increase of the fuel price. In this case, it's 4.5. This is a fictive value. You need to know what the policy will be in the country. And based on those 4 values, you can now estimate the anticipated fuel use and the anticipated greenhouse gas emissions. You can see the equations in the row with data collection and calculation in this table. And by subtracting the anticipated greenhouse gas emissions from the baseline emissions, you will end up with an estimation of the greenhouse gas impacts of this measure. So I want to move on to approach C, and I will only show you the differences of approach C compared to approach A. So I will not go into detail. All of the details are provided in the assessment guide. So what is different with approach C? The most important thing is that you have different system boundaries. So in general, with approach C, you only look at passenger transport. So you do not take freight transport into account. You look at an urban public transport system additionally to what you do in approach A. And because this is mainly urban, the whole system boundary is reduced to an urban context. Means you cannot do, or it's not advisable to do this approach for the whole country. It's better to do it for urban regions. And then you can expand the fuels that are used in the transport system with electricity, for instance, compared to approach A. Obviously, if you want to include other fuels, that's always possible, but you need to have the data to estimate the impacts on the other fuels. The next thing, which I have already highlighted, is that approach C is not only a top-down approach. You also have bottom-up elements in the data that you need, which makes it more complex, and I will show you that in a moment. And finally, you do not only use own price elasticities, but also cross-price elasticities, which show you how the demand for a substitute good will change if you increase the price, for instance, of gasoline. I will also explain this in a moment. So let's have a look at the bottom-up travel activity data, which is needed to conduct an approach C assessment. So you can see here on this list that it's much more than you need to conduct an approach A assessment. You need average vehicle kilometers traveled, you need distances traveled, load factors, and also average fuel consumption per vehicle kilometer. And you need this for different vehicle types as well. As I said, it's a combination of bottom-up and top-down data. So for the public transport, in specific for the rail transport, you can use top-down data, meaning the total of electricity and maybe diesel that's used in the rail transport sector and total passenger kilometers traveled with trains. Now, how does the demand impact work with those cross-price elasticities? As I already mentioned, you want to look at substitute goods. So imagining that the gasoline price increases by 10% because of a fuel tax. Then you want to know, how does the demand for public transportation change? So if you increase the price, relative prices of gasoline-fueled transportation will be higher, and people may switch to other transportation means, which I have said before. And if you can observe that change, and for instance, if it is plus 20%, this is just an example number. If you have plus 20% of increase in demand for public transportation because of the increase of the gasoline price, you will end up with an elasticity, with a cross-price elasticity of +2. Also, for the cross-price elasticities, default values are provided in the assessment guides. Again, I want to highlight that these are default values and they are uncertain. You can see that you have that we distinguish bus elasticities for bus systems and for rail systems. But the rest of the concept is similar as the table you have seen before for approach A. So you need the gasoline price and you need the income per capita. Now, for the greenhouse gas impacts, it's important to see that approach C is somehow different to approach A because you can read more and you can interpret more with approach C than you can with approach A. So for instance, in approach C, you can see how mode shifts may require an increase in capacity need for public transport. Because the fuel price increases, you will need more connections, more bus connections, for instance, because people switch to the bus. And you can see this with the assessment. This, however, leads to higher emissions, because if you increase the travel activity in public transport, you also increase the emissions from public transport. At the same time, you reduce the emissions from the gasoline consumption in private car transportation, but you need to take into account that you have some compensation at least through the increase in public transport. So to end my presentation, I want to say something about the interpretation of results, because as I said in the beginning, this is a simple approach. It's straightforward. It's meant to be usable by anyone with also little data available as a first step. But this means that there are some conditions to applicability because there are a lot of simplifications. So a country with special circumstances, for instance, very low or very high fuel prices, may not be able to apply those elasticity values that we have seen and get reliable results, because the elasticities work for moderate price changes. Also, if, for instance, fuel is a luxury good and only the most wealthy in a country can afford to drive a car that's powered with fuel, then this assessment will probably not work because those people are less price sensitive. And finally, if there are any political or legal processes that could hamper the whole impact of the measure, then also this approach is not going to lead to robust results. Second, it's important to highlight how the revenues of the fuel tax are used. If you imagine that a fuel tax is increased, then the government will have higher revenues through that. And it depends a lot on how those revenues are invested again. If the government invests those revenues into road infrastructure, then this will have an impact on future emissions, and it will change the impact of the measure, or it will influence the impact of the measure. So that's important to see. And finally, there are high uncertainties. I have mentioned this several times, but it's really important. So you need to estimate activity data and emission factors, and also those price elasticities. So because of that, it's really important that you are transparent when you do this assessment. You need to show what data you have been using, and if you can, you need to show what uncertainties are afflicted to this data. It's better to indicate a range of results, like the impact could lie lowest in that area and highest in another area. It's good to do a consistency check if you have data available, for instance, doing a top-down approach after having conducted a bottom-up approach. And finally, if you have done an ex-ante assessment, you can also do an ex-post assessment some years later to validate your results. And we would highly recommend to do that also in terms of monitoring. With that, I'm finished with my presentation, and I would like to hand over back to Josh and then to Dr. Elly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Felix, for a very salient presentation on those two assessment approaches. If you have any questions for Felix, you can find the presentation in the handout section of the dashboard, or if you have any follow-up clarification questions, please put them in the question section, and I will answer them for you so that you can then formulate your question for Felix later. So next we have Dr. Elly, who has led and worked in the Ministry of Transportation of the Republic of Indonesia for 35 years. She has been in some very major positions, such as the Director of Urban Transport System Development, and overseen some very pioneering projects in Indonesia, such as the mass rapid transit and the light rail transit projects, among many others. So, Dr. Elly, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours now as well. You will have to just unmute yourself.
Can you hear me well?
Yes, and your...
How about my presentation?
Yeah, you just need to activate it into a presentation mode.
Is it okay now?
Looks good. Yes, now it's great. Thank you very much, Dr. Elly.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. In Jakarta, here is already 8:30 p.m. in the evening.
Dr. Elly,
I would like to present you. Yes.
Now it's good. Thank you. Now it's in presentation.
Okay. Okay. I would like to present you our assessment for the impact of transport policies on reducing GHG emissions in Indonesia by using the ICAT guidelines. But I would like to show you Indonesia, a bit characteristic of Indonesia. So the government of Indonesia already we have the commitment to contribute to the global emissions for the reduction target through Indonesian nationally determined contributions to reduce our CO2 emissions by 29% or 41% by the international support. And it means that for the transportation sector, we have to reduce up to 11% or 14% with the international support. This is the characteristics of our transportations. You can have a look here, the growth of our vehicles. It is a very high growth year by year. And you see the motorcycles. It is a very big one. 82% of our vehicles it is motorcycles, and you can see here that the the energy that we are using for motorcycle, it is about 25%, and the pollutions impact by this motorcycle is also very high, 45%. So that's why we are really thanks to ICAT to assist us for assess our policies to see the impacts or to the GHG. So by using the ICAT guidelines, we would like to, we've been doing the assessment for 3 important policies. So these are the 3 policies. The first one, it is the pricing policies. It is regarding the fuel pricing policies. All of the policies that we are doing the assessment for the national wide area. So we are doing for the fuel pricing policies for the exposed from 2013 up to 2016, because there was a major milestone was the subsidy cut, yeah, since our last president Jokowi. Yeah, before we just give subsidy quite a lot to our energy. The second policy was the so-called LCGC, low cost green car. Yeah, so the vehicle purchase incentives for more efficient vehicles. We did also for the exposed 2013 up to 2017. So based on our government regulations, yeah, we exemptions the tax for the efficient vehicles. And the last policies we did already for the electric vehicles. This one for ex ante, we are doing for 2020 up to 2035. So in this case, the approach we are using approach B, as Felix already mentioned, there is approach A, B, and C. We are doing the approach B, and we are doing the separately for gasoline and diesel vehicles. Okay, now I'm coming for one by one to the results of those policy assessments. The first one, the fuel pricing. Yeah, you can have a look here. Last time we just give a lot of subsidy to our gasoline, to our fuels, but since 2014, yeah, you see it is going down, yeah, up to 66%, and instead we are using our money for the infrastructures. Yeah, so in this first January of 2015, yeah, the president officially removed the subsidy for gasoline RON 88 and a set fixed amount of 1,000 rupiah per liter for diesel. So our diesel still subsidized around for 7 US cents per liter. So these are the probability that could be done by the fuel policy. Yeah, the first one, if you higher the pricing of the fuel, it could be reduce the vehicle travel by vehicle using higher price fuel, and it could be also shift to higher occupancy rates. Yeah, and then it could be also by having a higher pricing of the fuel, the people will shift to other transport modes and shift to more fuel efficient vehicles. All of this impact, you know, will reduce the GHG emissions from the vehicle. And probably we could also have the revenue available, but we don't know the impact because it depends to how the revenue is spent. So these are the results, yeah, for the fuel pricing policy. So you can have a look here. We divide it into gasoline and diesel. For the gasoline itself, according to the guidelines, yeah, the increase of the price is around 24.24%, while for the diesel, it is minus 2.31%. Yeah, because actually the price of the diesel, it is almost the same from 2013 up to 2016. Yeah, but it, because of the inflations, yeah, they actually the price is going down. So the impact by this ICAT policy, yeah, by the fuel pricing policy, we got 6.30% our GHG going down, yeah, from 2016 up to 2013 up to 2016. And for the diesel, yeah, it is still positive, yeah, meaning that the GHG impact still going up, yeah, because we still have the subsidy for the diesel. Okay, now I'm coming to the second policy. It is regarding for the LCGC, low cost green car. Yeah, the LCGC introduced since 2013. So LCGC means that cars with capacity less than 1,200 or 1,500 cc, and the policy is based on tax cuts. So there is no more tax for these vehicles. So this LCGC may have enjoyed two type of subsidies. The first one, exemptions from sales of luxury goods, and the second one, it is for the fuel price. So according to the ICAT guidelines, yeah, these are the possibility, the impact of the tax reductions for such kind of policy. So by tax reductions, it could be more LCGC vehicle sales on the road. Yeah, by having more LCGC car, there should be increased vehicle kilometers travel and reduced traffic speed due to the congestions. So by this policy, it will increase even the GHG emissions. The next possibility by this policy, yeah, it could increase fuel consumptions. Yeah, and it will shift from conventional public transport to private car. Yeah, this one also mean to increase the GHG emissions. Yeah, but the government also got the revenue for the industrial sector, but it's depend the impact to the how the revenue was used. So according to the ICAT guidelines, yeah, we got these results. Yeah, so you can have a look here from 2013 up to 2017, the LCGC number, this one with the policy, 2013, 45 something thousand of our vehicles. In 2017, it is becoming 850,000 something cars. But this one, it is not direct growing by this policy, but we can have a look on the bottom here. This one is the baseline, yeah, meaning if there is no policy of LCGC. Because our growing of car ownership, it is also high. So actually without LCGC, we got 667,000 something. So the comparison with and without policy, it's 850 something. We compare to 667 something. So by the policy, we can have a look here, the total emissions. Yeah, in 2013, 86 something thousand, and in 2017, it is becoming 1,600,000 something. So if we compare the baseline, yeah, and then we got 13.66% increase of our GHG emissions. So by this LCGC, meaning our policy even higher our GHG emissions. Okay, now I'm coming to the last pricing, the last policy that we are doing the assessment by ICAT guidance. It is regarding the electric vehicles. So in August 2019, the government officially issued the presidential regulations to accelerate our electric vehicle program because it is estimates that 60% of the key components of EV is battery, and Indonesia has access to produce raw materials such as cobalt and manganese. So that's why we have the target, yeah, to be the center for EV productions in the region of Southeast Asians. Yeah, so for this one, ex-ante calculations being done, and emission factor on upstream also included with reference to our Ministry of Mineral and Resources data. Okay, this is again the impact by introducing the electric vehicles. Yeah, it could be reduce the GHG emission, or it could be even decrease, yeah, the GHG emissions. Yeah, by introducing the electric vehicles, and then it will increase the sales and larger market share for low GHG vehicles. Probably it will be give the impact to lowering the average GHG emission per vehicle kilometer traveled, and then the long-term improvement in technology. So by this, it will reduce the GHG emissions. But we also have to be alert that by this, because cheaper vehicles, yeah, we're expecting the vehicles would be cheaper with the normal one, and it will the same impact probably could be done such like our LCGC policy. The lower cost per vehicle kilometer will be happens, and it will increase the vehicle kilometers. Yeah, and the higher levels of car ownership, it will increase vehicle kilometers travel. So these two will increase the GHG emissions. Okay, we are doing these parameters or assumptions, yeah, to calculate our GHG emission CO2. The first one, the gasoline, we are using for RON 92, for the CO2, 72.60 ton per terajoule. And for the electricity vehicles, it is 0.84 ton CO2 equivalent per megawatt hours. Yeah, the average value of all grid emission grid factor in Indonesia. And for the energy consumptions per kilowatt hour kilometer for the electric vehicles, we got the figures from iNFRAS. For passenger car, 0.182 kilowatt hours per kilometer, while for motorcycle, 0.0636 kilowatt hours per kilometers. And the average kilometer traveled, according to our survey, it is around 30 kilometers per day, or 10,898 kilometers per year. So this is the result for our EV policy. This is the business as usual result, and this one, the scenario intervention with the EV policy. So we can have a look here for business as usual. For the new vehicles, yeah, the emission will be such a number. But if we apply the EV policy with 70% still fossil fuel vehicles and 30% the electric vehicles, then the emissions will be going down up to 7.51% in year of 2035 from 2020. And if the power plant generated by coal and renewable energy 50%, then we can going down even the GHG emissions doubled up to 15.39%. Yeah, so this is we can have a look the figures. The blue one, emissions with EV policy, and the yellow one, it is emissions emissions with the EV policy, and the blue one, emission business as usual. So we can have a look here by the power plant generated 50% for the coal and renewable. We can get the 15.39% of reductions of our CO2. Okay, so those all the results of our assessment by using the ICAT guidelines. So I will conclude my presentations with the findings that there has been quite positive GHG impact from gasoline RON 88 subsidy removal. However, we have to be careful before drawing final conclusion, because we are introducing during this policy a new gasoline of RON 90, which this one, it is not subsidized. According to the model simulations, if subsidy on diesel remove the 1,000 rupiah one, then it will give impact for the emissions. Yeah. And the GHG impact from LCGC policy may bring negative impact. So it means that our policy, we should evaluate it for this one, yeah, because regarding the environment, even this policy increase the GHG emissions, yeah, because the ownership of the car increase. Okay, the EV policy intervention is projected to contribute to significant reductions of GHG. Yeah. Further reductions may be predicted when fiscal incentives such as removal of luxury taxes for EV could be implemented, as in our current projections. More than 80% of the vehicles within projected timeline are two-wheelers. Yeah, it's also not fully correct if we analyze the impact only by looking at the reduced fuel consumption, as EVs are still relying on the electricity grid for charging. Therefore, we suggest further studies also cover well-to-tank emissions for EV. As simulated, power plant generated by higher renewable energy impacts much more positive to the emissions. In general, the guidance is very helpful to us, and it is also very simple to use. But we are expecting that for the next one, these guidelines can modify to some other some other policies. Yeah, so probably it is not only for pricing policy. Furthermore, the document also provides useful guidance to better understand the economic instruments which go beyond fuel prices, such as incentive for efficient vehicle, biofuel, etc., that could be used to improve environmental conditions, mainly in terms of GHG emission reductions. Okay, that's all my presentations. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Dr. Elly, as well. Thank you for sharing the excellent work that you are doing in Indonesia, and being familiar myself with Jakarta, that's an extra acknowledgement for the work that you're doing in terms of transportation in Jakarta. So next up we have, as it's loading, Buddika, who's from ClimateSI and who is also contributing his insight and expertise from the MRV standards in Sri Lanka, and he's going to present on how they established a national MRV system in Sri Lanka. So, Buddika, thank you for joining us as well.
Yeah.
And you're good to...
Okay. Thank you, Jos, for organizing the webinar. Thanks a lot, and thanks, Henning, also for inviting me to this webinar. Is it clear? Can you hear me clearly?
Very clearly. Thanks, Buddika.
Okay, good. Yeah. And good morning and good afternoon, maybe good evening for some of the participants. My name is Buddika from ClimateSI, as Jos mentioned. So in my presentation, which would be around 15 minutes, covering 20 slides, I'm going to present you application of ICAT transport pricing guidance for 4 transport pricing policies in Sri Lanka. Okay. So we basically applied the ICAT transport pricing guidance for 4 policies in total. 2 policies are as part of developing a transport sector MRV system, which was supported by ICAT. And 1 policy is a carbon tax. Actually, that carbon tax, which was an existing policy at that time, which was designed based on the engine capacity and fuel type actually. And also the excise duty, which was also an existing policy, but both policies were in line with the first NDCs submitted by Sri Lanka for the transport sector. And then we also applied another 2 policies, a cordon price, which was a new NDC introduced as part of revision of NDC, which was also supported by the ICAT. And then we also applied another policy, which is a carbon tax, which was sort of a scientific carbon tax based on the fuel type, which was also introduced as part of revising the NDCs in Sri Lanka. And actually, these both were supported by Dr. Henning's and ICAT team, and also UNEP DTU team based in Copenhagen, Patema, Dennis, Subhas, and entire team. They supported us throughout the all 4 assignments. And from Sri Lankan side, actually, Climate Change Secretary Dr. Jayatunga, and then Transport Ministry Additional Secretary Mr. Tilakaratna Banda. So they are the team actually who worked on these assignments. Okay, so with regard to the application of the transport pricing guidance for carbon tax and excise duty in Sri Lanka, as Felix also mentioned, actually there are certain steps to be followed, and we followed those steps. In the first step, actually, we defined the policy. and in this case, it's a carbon tax to promote the electric vehicles in Sri Lanka. So this is an important matter, and which is aligned with the NDC 8.4, basically promoting the electric vehicles. And then, of course, the general objectives was also reduce the emissions, save fuel consumption, and as well the fuel efficiency. But most important thing is actually this was an existing policy, and then it is to promote the electric vehicle, replacing the conventional gasoline-based vehicles. And for the excise duty, which was also same, that government was trying to promote the electric vehicles by giving certain the concession for electric vehicle, while higher duties on the gasoline vehicles. Again, it was also in line with the NDC 8.4 and with the same objectives. And the time period, we have quantified the GHG emission from 2021 to 2030. Just only the transport sector, and we considered only the land transport actually. Territorial bound is only Sri Lanka, and in terms of GHG emissions, we have considered only the CO2 out of 7 greenhouse gases. And indeed, I also want to mention that then when we were trying to apply the ICAT pricing guidance as it is, sometimes, as probably you might be aware, there are so many tools, but sometimes you can't apply as it is, right? We need to do some changes. And in this particular case, actually, we had to limit the application to only the car fleets. We did not apply for all the vehicles. I mean, like the buses, vans were not included. And then grid emission factor, according to the methodology, it requires to use the grid emission factor in kilogram CO2 per kilowatt hour as the unit, but by terajoule as a unit, but we applied by kilowatt hour. Actually, these changes we discussed with the UNEP DTU and also the VERA team, who engaged us with this exercise, and in consultation with them, actually we adopted these changes. And that's also, I see some good advantage ICAT pricing guidance actually, because you may be able to adjust it and depending on the country context and the situation. And so this is very flexible methodology. So I think as Felix mentioned, there were 3 approaches to quantify the base year emissions, and we selected the approach C, of course, because we had the information available to go for the comprehensive assessment and by fuel type, and therefore we went for that option. I'm not going to explain in detail because Felix has already covered. So with regard to the emissions, actually we applied the basic emission calculation. We did the GHG emissions for the baseline scenario. Baseline scenario was the use of the conventional vehicles like the petrol and diesel vehicle in the absence of the electric vehicles. And then to quantify the GHG impact, we applied again the ICAT transport pricing guidance formulas. Like Felix mentioned about, the market share we calculated for Sri Lankan context, and then annual vehicle sales per kilometer reduction. So those values we calculated, and some of the values actually, like what is in the purple we calculated, and then what is in black actually we got from the existing sources. And this is the result of the emissions actually when we applied the ICAT transport pricing guidance for carbon tax. As you can see, actually the percentage change of the share of electric vehicle in the baseline scenario, we have done the calculation for 2018 actually, since we had some data, and the percent share was only 1.91, whereas with the carbon tax, it has increased very slightly. I mean, this is very marginal increase. The one of the reason actually carbon tax is not very high. And it is, I can say, like in Sri Lankan context, the price of 1 liter of petrol is around 70 cents US dollars, and then the carbon price is actually less than 1 cent, so which is not sufficient. And later we did another study actually with another on another assignment. We found that if you want to have a significant impact, you need to increase at least by 50%. So basically, you have to increase the carbon tax by like 35 cents US dollars per liter. So since this is not a very high, actually did not have a significant impact. As you can see, actually by 2030, if you apply the carbon tax at this rate, right, So it could reduce only around 500 tons of CO2, right? And but most importantly, excise duty, which is a very important. You can see that percentage change. So without the excise duty, so electric vehicle share is around only 1.9%, whereas with the excise duty, in particular to promote the electric vehicle, the share will be increased to 8%. So this is a significant share. And one of the main reasons actually for electric vehicles, government has reduced the excise duty by 50%. So that's why it has a significant impact. So even the emission reductions, actually you can see the baseline emissions without the excise duty on electric vehicles. So emission would be around 3.5 million. With that lesser excise duty, actually it will come down to 3.4 million. So around 100,000 ton of CO2 reduction only for the cars. Yeah, and these are the results actually I already mentioned. So fuel savings and all. And also we applied the ICAT pricing guidance for carbon tax, which is a scientific carbon tax based on the fuel consumption and the carbon price actually. So we followed the steps in the guidance. And yeah, so this is the basic information. I think I can skip those information. So we have applied directly the formulas in the ICAT pricing guidance, which are applicable for Sri Lankan context. And then in terms of the result, actually, if you can see, when we apply a cordon price, actually cordon price we applied only for the one of the major city, which is Colombo Municipal Council. And then we found that actually without the cordon price, having a sort of tax when a vehicle enter into the city. So by 2030, actually, the emissions due to those vehicles would be around 85,000. With the cordon price, actually, it can be reduced to around 70,000. So this is also a significant reduction because it's only for one city. And the same thing, if you apply the carbon tax on a scientific basis, actually, it can also help to reduce the emissions by around 100,000 because this year you are going to set the carbon tax on the fuel. Yeah. So this is my last slide. Actually, one of the most important impact that I want to mention that in the Sri Lankan, for the policymakers, they were really interested to promote the electric vehicle or low emission vehicle. Actually, I want to mention one thing. According to one of the studies by UNDP, Sri Lanka had the highest share of hybrid vehicle compared to any other country in the world. This is mainly due to this excise tax, duty tax, because it reduced the excise duty tax by 50% for electric and hybrid vehicles. And that sort of policies were introduced mainly due to the support from the policymakers and the political regime. But policymakers are interested to introduce, but they didn't have a tool to quantify what would be the impact of such policies if they introduce. So ICAT pricing guidance actually is very useful because now they can quantify the GHG impact of the policies before they discuss those things with the politicians and all. So that will really help policymakers to justify the advantages, like what would be the GHG impact, emission reduction due to these policies, and other SD impacts and all. Indeed, this additional Secretary of the Transport, Mr. Tilakaratna Banda, he even presented the results of this value at the Green Climate Fund in order to access the climate finance also. And so this was a very useful tool for the policymakers. And then one of the things that I realized actually, this is also sort of a barrier, maybe that things that we can improve from the ICAT pricing guidance. Here, when you apply the multiple transport pricing policies, because sometimes it's a bit difficult to differentiate whether this emission reduction is attributed only to the policy being assessed. So because other policies can also have some interaction. So we need to make sure that there should be the avoidance of the double counting of the emission reduction. So when this is something that I think we need to think about, we had a discussion with the Vera at that time actually how to address that point. Maybe Felix can indicate whether they have sort of have addressed this improvement. Yeah, I think that's all from my presentation, and thanks again for everyone for organizing this webinar. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Buddika, for a really nice presentation. And And I think I'd like to say, because you are officially the last presenter in the series of these webinars, the point that you did finish on was incredibly relevant, because it is about putting sound data and information into the hands of policymakers so that they can further implement and design their policies and actions. So, and well done for the highest number of hybrid cars in the world as well through the excise tax. I'd like to take this opportunity to say a really big thank you to all the presenters so far in this webinar. They've been incredibly valuable for all our speakers. Just one moment as I update the screen. Yeah, and we now come to the part of, okay, sorry, everybody, yeah. Okay, yeah, you do see my screen. Yeah, where we have the Q&A session. So thank you everyone for lodging your questions in the question box. And we will go through them now. So please, in those moments that I'm pausing to fix up the screen, send in further questions. Again, the presentations are in the handout section in case you need to clarify anything yourself to formulate the question. But we'll dive right in. And the first one is for Felix, and I guess for some supplementary help from Dr. Elly and Buddika, is whether or not a technical review at the domestic level is necessary.
Thanks for this question. Can you hear me, Josh?
Perfectly. Thanks, Felix.
Good. So, I mean, let me put it like this. It's probably never wrong to do a technical review of such an assessment. It obviously depends on your resources and on what the reasons are you are doing the assessment for. If you do a very simple assessment, the review can be shorter. And I guess it's never wrong to do a review also with those easy approaches, because you make mistakes, you can always make mistakes. And it's someone else that looks at the document or at the calculations may have some ideas for simple improvements which you could use after the review. I hope that answers the question. Maybe Dr. Elly or Buddika want to add something about this because they have made the experience themselves.
Yeah, okay, I think, thanks, Josh, for the question. I also agree that because this technical review can be an important element. One of the reason actually what I understand, because this ICAT has a strength of having a sort of tools for the policy assessment, right? And this is also sort of a first of its kind policies. This is my impression, right? And therefore, especially because if you look at the project level emission impact, because there are so many tools, but policy level GHG impacts, there are less tools actually, right? So then these are the early stage of evolution of the policy level GHG impact assessment tool. So therefore, having some sort of reviewers, right? Because we need to do a lot of expert judgment in certain areas, right? So it's very important to have some sort of review by national experts or maybe international expert or some policymakers, right? Yeah.
Dr. Elly, in case you're having trouble like myself of unmuting yourself, the next question is coming to you, and it is if you could kindly give some information about any negative impacts of policies taken to reduce GHG emissions, particularly on the social level, and how or if the government has dealt with them. You're still unmuted, Dr. Elly. Okay, now I'm going to. Okay, Dr. Elly. Yeah, you're still muted, but I'll move on to the next question. So I'll come back to you after this one. Okay. The next question is asking that we've so far seen individual policy analysis using the guidance. So is there a way to analyze a combination of such policies? So I think I will open this up to Henning and then also refer to Felix for any supporting statements.
Thank you very much, George, and again, big thank you to the excellent presentations, to the presenters. So this is a very important question, indeed, a question we got from several countries that wanted to look at a portfolio of policies rather than just individual policies. And of course, when you look at your NDCs, then you look at a combination of climate actions that you want to analyze in parallel. So that is the limitation of the assessment guides, and that's why we introduced modeling tools to complement the assessment guides. Indeed, Sri Lanka is an example where first individual policies were assessed, and then that data was utilized as part through a modeling tool that could compare the different policy impacts and assess a combination of policies and climate actions. So one of the modeling tools that we utilize is from one of our implementing partners, UNEP DTU Partnership. It's called GACMO, and allows an assessment of various mitigation options in combination. It's a fairly simple tool, which then also allows users to add their own options to the assessment and modify all the data there. So it's really a tool that allows for comparisons. And we also have collaboration with the New Climate Institute that has developed a tool called Prospects Plus. And there a number of add-ons allow for sustainable development impact assessments. And those two tools are used for ICAT country projects. And ICAT also funds further development of these tools to then allow support to countries as needed and as required by.
Thank you, Henning. And Felix, would you like to add anything to that?
I think excellent answer from Henning. I mean, this question has accompanied us throughout the whole development of the assessment guide. And also we know that Sri Lanka has been struggling with that, Indonesia as well. And I think it's good that this is addressed with those tools and that this is further elaborated on.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Felix. Dr. Elly, are you able to join us for the next question?
Yes, probably Felix could help me because I cannot hear you. Just sorry for this.
Okay, not a problem. So Felix and Dr. Elly is asking Dr. Elly if she could kindly give some information about the negative impacts of policies taken to reduce GHG emissions, particularly on the social level, and how the government has dealt with that.
Yes, okay. Elly, can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Good. So the question is, if the government, if you have been dealing with the negative impact of the assessment and of the policy mainly on the social level, so negative impacts of the policy on the social level and how the government is dealing with those negative impacts.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. So we really would like to thanks to ICAT, yeah, because at the beginning we are just thinking for, for the social things. yeah, make easy for the people for having their private cars. But actually, we do also have the commitment, yeah, to reduce our emissions. Yeah, by ICAT now, our ministry is very busy. Yeah, we just evaluate our policy now for the LCGC especially. Yeah, probably LCGC we would like to remove this policy. So we really would like to thanks to ICAT, yeah, already help us, because during the assessment, all the ministries, like ministries of transportations, the energy ministries, the financing ministries, and some other ministries, they are involved in these assessments. So this is one of our benefit, yeah, working together when we are doing the assessment. Yeah, so we should thinking about this. Now it is still on the evaluations to remove even this policy. Thank you for ICAT.
And thank you, Dr. Elly. Our next question is, I think, drawing on at first Buddika and asking if there's any rebounds impact due to hybrid vehicle introduction. So unfortunately, that's a technical term for me, a rebounds impact.
Can you please repeat the question, Jos? I did not get it quite.
No problem. Is there any rebounds impact due to hybrid vehicle introduction?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very good question actually. In Sri Lanka, we, due to the introduction of the hybrid, because in terms of the price also, the price of hybrid vehicles was also very competitive with the conventional vehicle compared to the other countries. And but you know that anyway, this latest technologies like hybrid vehicle, electric vehicle, consumers have some concern about the batteries and also the maintenance. So therefore, introduction of less taxes on hybrid vehicles or the sort of lower price did not lead to have more vehicles into the economy, right? So therefore, I consider that there were no big rebound effect. I mean, the number of vehicles was not significantly increased due to the less tax, but rather the conventional vehicles were replaced by the hybrid vehicles. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Buddika. The next question is looking at, okay, since road type as well as influences on vehicle fuel consumption, for example, cement, concrete road, bitumen road, how would you consider such impact on transport pricing policies? So the road, looking at the road type in terms of fuel consumption. Did you find that that played a role in your assessments? So either Dr. Elly or Buddika.
Felix, can you help me? I cannot hear what you said.
Honestly, I also didn't understand the question. Could you put it into the chat so we can read it?
Sure. So it's asking whether or not the road type of road influenced the vehicle fuel consumption, and therefore would you consider that that impacts in the transport pricing policies?
So if I understand correctly, I may have a go at this. The question is directed towards the condition of the roads that will then have an impact on the fuel consumption of the car. And this, I mean, this is not included in the assessment guide, because what we are looking at is how the, I mean, we are looking at how does the fuel consumption change due to a price increase. Obviously, if in the same time frame that you're doing the assessment for, you are renewing all of your roads or the main roads, and the fuel consumption may be less because of that, then this is an impact that you may see in an ex post assessment, but which is not included in those elasticities. In an ex ante assessment, you will not see this impact because it does only look at the change in fuel demand, and it does not account for any changes or for any current conditions in the road network. I hope this answered the question.
Yeah, I think, can I also add one thing on that, Jos?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, this is a very good question actually, because it is also connected with some of the NDCs that we were working in Sri Lanka, because the road condition, right, like Felix mentioned. So especially when we have highways, because having a toll price can also be a sort of transport pricing policy, and we were thinking about whether to have the impact assessment on this toll price. But then we found in certain research papers that highways, due to the highways, you can have higher emissions, right? So, but I don't know how we can scientifically prove these things actually, because, for example, in general vehicle, when you go, actually you have a better fuel economy on the highways, right? So this is an area I think we can also think about, addressing in the ICAT pricing policies in future, like sort of improvement, because most of the countries have highways and the toll prices, transport pricing policies, and how to incorporate the road conditions, right, into the policy. Yeah.
Can I add something?
Of course, Dr.
Yes. So actually, this is a very interesting one, yeah, because like in Indonesia, we have a lot of our freight vehicles. They are overloaded, yeah, overloaded. So they are moving very slow. So the emissions will be very high, yeah. But for our case, for the assessment that we have done, it is only for the nationwide. So it is very simple. And then I was thinking for the next one, for next future, yeah, we have to make it in smaller area. So we can probably consider some factors, something like that, because it is really important, because we cannot handle, yeah, these violations. Yeah, violations. So they have to take the good, for instance, 100%, but now up to 300% even. So by having the assessment, probably it can also push the government, yeah, to avoid this violation. Thank you, Jos.
You're welcome, and thank you, Dr. Elly. I was searching for a few more questions to fit in, but in respect of time, I think I might take this opportunity to wrap things up. So I would like to say, first of all, to all the online colleagues, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for lodging your questions. I hope they were all answered. To our speakers online, thank you so much, Felix and Dr. Elly, Buddika, and Henning, for joining us and sharing your expertise and your experiences for applying the ICAT assessment guides. I'd like to quickly plug that it is the webinar series, and that we have had 6 webinars, so please either visit climateactiontransparency.org to visit and see the recordings from these previous webinars. And also the presentations there. Please also follow us on Twitter at ICAT Climate, or sign up via the subscription form on our website, climateactiontransparency.org, for future updates and also future webinars. And I would also ask you to please spend 2 to 3 minutes. The evaluation form will pop up once this webinar finishes. Please fill that out so we can continue delivering webinars exactly like this one, where we have a range of international and national experts delivering the information that you need. So with that, thank you so much, everybody. And I really wish you a lovely morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.